So question for us to wrestle with a little bit as we get started. And maybe it's a question that, a lot of people, they come to consider Christianity. Maybe they hear what we have to say. They start, considering some of these things. And maybe they come upon a question in their minds. And maybe that question is like, why couldn't God just forgive us? Like, maybe nothing had to happen. Why couldn't he just forgive us? If you think through the thought processes of, what people might have, maybe that we've had in times past. And you might think, if God is loving, if God is merciful, if he is gracious, then why did Jesus have to die? Like, why the cross? Like, why all the suffering? Why all the bloodshed and all of that? Like, you maybe ask these questions like why couldn't God just decide to let it go? Like, why couldn't he just overlook our sin and move on? And I think at a surface level, when you first start considering some of these questions, on the surface level, that might sound kind of reasonable to us. Like, why wouldn't God just, overlook these things? You might think that, maybe that sounds like a compassionate response to the problems that we've had. But before we even consider God's side of things, I think that asking questions like that is kind of revealing of us a little bit. Because if we were to ask something like that, when we ask as a human being, like, well, why couldn't God just forgive me? Like, why couldn't he just forgive us? There's a part of that sounds a little bit like we don't think our sin or our problems are that big of a deal. Because why didn't God just let it go? We don't see it maybe as that big of a deal. And if we don't take our sin seriously, then maybe we think that the forgiveness of it should just be really easy. Maybe we think it should be cheap. Maybe we think it should cost nothing to forgive me. But the reality is what we're going to look at this morning is that if forgiveness was easy, if it was cheap, if it cost nothing, then Jesus wouldn't have been hanging on that cross. When Jesus was sweating blood in the garden and he asked his Father, he said, is there any other way? Would you take this cup from me if there was any other way? But we know that story, and we know that there was no other way in that moment. And Jesus purposed himself forward towards these things. So again, as we get into these things today, as we consider these things, what we're looking to understand is really what really happened on the cross. Why was Jesus' death absolutely necessary for us? And what exactly did he accomplish when he died? And I think we really need to understand these things because this isn't just like learning theology information for the sake of learning theology information. Like, understanding these core truths matters for every day of your life. Really understanding these things, I think it brings stability in the midst of sometimes really unstable times because it anchors us. It gives us something that's true even when everything else is messed up. So when we look at this passage this morning, we're kind of just looking at this passage as a backdrop to pull some really important truths out of it. But some context, again, we've looked at this before. This is the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet who lived 700 years before Jesus walked this earth. That's 7 centuries or 35 generations of people before Jesus came here. Isaiah, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wrote this passage that we're going to look at this morning. He talked about someone that would come, someone that would suffer, someone that would die, and their death would accomplish something very specific. And so let's read this. We're going to read the entire chapter of Isaiah 53. And it's kind of going to be our backdrop for what we're talking about today. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he bore our griefs. He carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open up his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment. Who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. And he shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many. He shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death. He was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Again, like I said, this was 700 years before Jesus was born. 700 years. For us, when we've read the gospel accounts, and like we went through the book of Matthew, we've read the gospel accounts, we've considered some of these things. I believe when you read Isaiah 53, after reading the gospel accounts, it's like, that's Jesus. Like, what other conclusion am I coming to? You know, I've seen there's like some evangelistic ministries and stuff that have gone into Israel, and they just encourage people, read Isaiah 53. I'll read it for you. Because they're like, who's that talking about? And I've seen the conversation like, well, it sounds like it's talking about this Jesus that you guys talk about. It is. It actually is, because it lines up with the account of everything that he did. I believe it's unmistakable that this is talking about Jesus. But when you see this, again, this was written so long before he came. And so we see that this was the plan all along. Like, there wasn't any plan B. There wasn't a different way that our salvation was going to be accomplished. God announced his rescue plan centuries before it happened, and then he did it. And we're going to look at what he did. We're going to talk about some of the specifics of that. But again, for us to get to kind of the whole context and the whole picture of this morning, so we can fully appreciate what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross, like, we need to stop once again and consider really why. Like, we need to understand the problem that made the rescue necessary. Because if we don't understand how bad the problem is, we'll never really appreciate how good the solution is in the cross of Jesus Christ. So again, let's stop to consider ourselves as human beings, as we are, for a moment. I'm not going to say everybody thinks this way, but I'm sure you've heard these comments. Maybe you've made these comments about yourself before. I think that most people in general have the idea that I'm basically a good person, you know? I'm basically a good person. Sure, I've made some mistakes, but nobody's perfect. Maybe when I compare myself to others, maybe when I compare myself to the crazy things that I see the news showing me about people every day, well, in light of some of those things, like, I feel like, you know, I'm not hurting people. Like, I'm not committing any crimes. I think I'm basically good. Like, I think I'm basically a good person. And that thought process for us is kind of natural. But when we kind of stay in that thought process, when we stay in this mindset of like, well, I think I'm basically a good person and I don't really have much to worry about. Like, the thing that happens when we think that way is that we begin minimizing the problem. Like, we begin downplaying, we begin minimizing the problem. We might start grading ourselves on a curve. We might start just comparing ourselves to others instead of comparing ourselves to God's standard. Again, when we think of just life situations that maybe we struggle with, maybe we're going through right now, you know, maybe you think of your workplace. There's always something that you could call out in your workplace, but maybe, you know, someone's getting credit for something I did. And I know it, they know it, but they're still getting the credit for it. Or Maybe our boss calls us out on somebody, calls us out in front of other people, and we didn't like that, and it's a problem. Instead of responding from us with graciousness in the situation, maybe I respond with, well, now I got something to say about you behind your back. I'm going to talk this up, And maybe we begin pointing out people's flaws. Maybe we begin making sure everybody else has a problem with these people now. And we justify that to ourselves sometimes. It's like, I'm just being honest about the situation. Like, I'm just telling it like it is. It's not necessarily what we should be saying, but like, it just is what it is, We can justify things that way. Maybe we have, people problems outside of work. I mean, kind of much the same thing, but maybe we got into an issue with somebody. Maybe we started it. Maybe we didn't. But since then, we've been, willfully carrying around bitterness and anger. Again, maybe we've been speaking harshly about people behind their back. Maybe we've been plotting out how I'm going to get even with people. Maybe we've been trying to justify our bitterness and our anger because they did this, they said that, but I don't actually reflect to see, well, like, what's the problem in me that I'm wanting to hold on to bitterness and anger? And there's so many other things. Maybe it's pride. Maybe I look at other people and I'm like, I could do that way better than you, and I am way better than you. I should have that job, not you, whatever else. I felt that way before. Maybe our problem is envy. Maybe I look at what everybody else has and I'm like, I don't have that, and I deserve that. I feel like I deserve that. So I begin resenting the people around me. Again, commonly, maybe it's lust. We got these little devices in our pockets all the time. Maybe we sit there at night scrolling through things that we should not be looking at. Maybe that's the problem. But we rationalize these things saying, I'm not acting on it. It's just, it's just thoughts. They don't really count. I can rationalize all of these things away. And again, when we consider maybe like what runs through our heads in these types of situations is, again, I just see these things like, oh, these are just little things. Like, it's not that bad. It's not that bad that I do these things because other people do things that are way worse. I'm not hurting anybody. I see it as a small thing, and I feel like God understands that it's a small thing. Again, we have all these methods that we begin rationalizing these things with. But again, in light of God and His standard, we can ask another question that we should be thinking about. Like, who gets to decide what's that bad? Like, who gets to make that decision? When we consider who sets the standards that we have to live by, like, who sets the standard? Is it you? Is it me? Is it just whatever I feel like is the right thing in that moment, whether it's good or whether it's bad? And obviously, that's not where things are headed this morning. Because God sets the standard. And God's standard, as we talked about in previous weeks, God's standard is not just better than average. It's not just, I look at this person and they're worse than me, so I must be okay. God's standard is not better than average. God's standard is perfection. And that's what God's standard is. And again, we hear that, and that we have to kind of stop in our tracks. So we're probably like, come on, like, that's not fair. I'm already not perfect at this point. Nobody's perfect. And this is what we've just talked about in previous weeks. It's exactly what we were talking about a couple of weeks back. That apart from Jesus, we're all doomed by the standard. And that's kind of the whole point of understanding these things. When we looked at a couple of weeks ago at Matthew 5, and Jesus made this statement, He says, therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. He made this statement. He set the standard at perfection. It's not like just improving. It's not just trying your best. It's not, as long as you're basically a good person. The standard He set forth was perfection. And we sit here today, I hope every one of us sits here today and understands, like, I'm nowhere close to that. I'm not anywhere close to that. And if the truth of that really begins to settle down on us, we start to understand that the problem isn't just that we make mistakes. The problem is that every single sin, every single one of them, is an offense against our perfect, holy God. Again, in our kind of human problems, we think in human terms. We like to compare our sins against other people's sins. We like to think that mine's not as bad as theirs. But we're not really at the core sinning against each other. Like I think of David's statements in the Psalms. David makes this statement. He reflected on everything bad that he did, even getting Bathsheba's husband killed and all those things. And he says, God, against you and you alone have I sinned. He's like, my sin's not just against the person. At the end of the day, my sin's against the God, my God. And when we begin to realize that, when we begin to understand that we're not just sinning against each other, we're sinning against God, we're sinning against an infinite, perfect God. When we as a limited, small, created human being commits an offense against the unlimited, infinite, perfect, holy God, that carries a lot of weight. And I think some people look at this like, well, why is God so bothered by my sin? Is God just petty and easily offended? Like, that's not the case. What we begin to have to understand is that there is just a massive gap between who I am and who He is. Every sin that I commit is an offense against, again, infinitely holy, infinitely worthy God. That means that even the small sins are big because it's against Him. You think we've been studying God, we've been considering, we've been learning His characteristics. We've talked about His holiness, His perfection, His glory. The God who spoke the very universe into existence, the God that sustains every breath that we breathe. That's the God that we sin against every time we sin, every single day. It's not just breaking a rule. Every sin is personal rebellion against the one who made us, against the one who gave us life, against the one who deserves our complete devotion. In Isaiah 53 here in verse 6, it talks about this. It says that all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And that's the essence of sin. It's not just doing bad things. It's choosing our own way instead of God's way. It's seeking independence from Him. It's, I get to decide what's right for me. I'm not considering really what His standard is. It's like, I'm going my way. I'm considering what's right for me. And ultimately, biblical truth, the truth of it all is we're all guilty people standing before a holy judge of God. And if we compare all of this truth, you compare it to our legal system. In our legal system, true justice requires payment or punishment for the crime. That's justice. But I want you to understand something very carefully. Justice requiring payment doesn't mean that God is petty or vengeful. It just means that He's actually righteous. If a judge is perfectly just, they cannot just overlook the problems and remain just. If a judge lets guilty people walk free all the time, would we consider that to be a good judge? We would probably say that that's a corrupt judge if he's just just letting all the guilty people go free. That's a judge that is failing to uphold justice. But God is not a corrupt judge. He's perfectly just, which means that sin has to be dealt with and the penalty has to be paid. And in light of that, this is what we're trying to understand right now, is how does a perfectly just God save guilty people without compromising His justice? How does a perfectly just God save guilty people without compromising His justice? That's a huge question. Ultimately, the answer to that question lies in the cross, and we're going to consider that because on the cross, Jesus took our place. Again, when we continue that analogy, it's like we can imagine ourselves standing in the courtroom in front of that perfectly just judge. When we stand in that courtroom, we're the defendant. Again, perfectly just judge, we're standing in the courtroom, we're the defendant in this scenario. The evidence against us is overwhelming, the facts are clear, and the judge, who is perfectly fair and perfectly just, looks at us and pronounces the verdict. The verdict, obviously, in our case, guilty. We know we're guilty. There's no denying it. Biblically, we know that the sentence for the guilt of sin is death. That's what justice demands. When we're standing in this, proverbial courtroom, we can't pay off this debt. We can't, work our way out. We can't bargain or plead our case. There's a standing sentence against sin, and that sentence is death. And you stand, again, this, hypothetical courtroom. I mean, the reality of it is real. But you stand there, you feel the weight of I hope we've all felt the weight of, I'm truly guilty. And the Bible says that the holiness of God demands basically a death penalty for sin. But in that moment, something happens. Someone steps forward. Again, it's what we looked at last time when we were talking about Jesus. Someone perfect steps forward. They have a spotless record. They've never broken a single law. They're completely innocent. They're completely righteous. He walks up to the judge and he says, I'll take the sentence. Put it on me and let the guilty one go free. The judge in this hypothetical scenario can ask this one. It's do you understand what you're offering? This isn't your crime. You don't have to do this. But that one that steps up says, I know, I chose to, and I'll take their place. And this is an act of what we would call substitution. Jesus takes our place. Jesus didn't die on that cross because he deserved to die. Jesus had never sinned. He was perfect. He is the only human being who ever lived a life of perfect, total obedience to God. But he died anyway. He took the sentence that was meant for us. He stepped into our place and said, I'll bear this penalty. Remember the last time we met, we talked about this passage we call it the Great Exchange. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, and it says, again, pay close attention to this wording. It says, for he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He made him who knew no sin. We know that that is Jesus. God made him to be sin for us. God treated Jesus like he had lived our sinful life. God poured out on Jesus the judgment that our sin deserved. And in exchange, God treats us like you lived Jesus' perfect life. As if you had never sinned. As if you had the righteousness of Christ himself. That's crazy. That's why it's called a great exchange, because it's our sin for his righteousness. It's our guilt for his innocence. It's our death for his life. And as we're really working to build up our foundations through this series, I want to go deeper on a few just theological words for us to consider. And one of them is really heavily rooted, and it's why we looked at this passage this morning. But the first one's easy. The first one is sacrifice. We can generally understand the word sacrifice. If we take it in biblical terms, we think of the Old Testament. When people sinned, they brought sacrifices or offerings to God. They would usually bring an animal. It's usually a lamb, and in their, the custom was the lamb needed to be perfect, needed to be without blemish, without spot, without defect, without flaw. And why was that? Because it was looking forward to something. The sacrifice represented perfection because it was pointing forward to the perfection of Jesus. It was a picture of what was coming in Jesus. Again, we've spent weeks looking at his life, his deity, his humanity, Jesus' sinless obedience. And why have we looked through all of those things? Because every one of those things matters in our salvation. Jesus' perfect life is what qualified him to be the perfect sacrifice for our sin. In verse 10 of this passage in Isaiah 53, Isaiah references him as an offering. He says, when you make his soul an offering for sin. There's this idea here that Isaiah uses. He uses the word offering because it's kind of calling back to that idea of the Old Testament offerings and the sacrificial system. Because Jesus was an offering, a sacrifice. Jesus gave himself. He voluntarily gave himself. He chose to. He walked forward and he completed the sacrifice all for us. All for us. There's a second word. We're talking about sacrifice, but propitiation. Not a word we commonly use. I don't think any of us have probably in day-to-day conversation ever used the word propitiation. But it's describing something very essential to understand our salvation. Propitiation means that God's righteous anger against sin was completely satisfied. God was righteously angry against sin and it was fully satisfied. And I know some of us might stop and say, I don't want to hear about God's anger. But again, it's something that we need to talk about. When the Bible talks about God's wrath or God's anger, it's not talking about God, like when we think of anger, we think of the problems we have, or we think about our kids throwing a temper tantrum. God's not throwing a temper tantrum. That's not anger in the way God works. When we talk about God's anger or wrath, we're talking about God's perfect, righteous response to evil. God has a perfect, righteous response to evil. If we considered God, and if we looked at it this way, what would it say about God if he looked at all of the evil in the world, all of the abuse, all of the injustice, all of the cruelty, and he did nothing about it? What would that say about him? What if he just didn't care? That wouldn't be loving. Like that would just be indifference. That would be indifference. When we talk about the holiness of God must respond to evil. A righteous judge must uphold justice. He can't just pretend that sin didn't happen. And I think people get confused in some of this. I think they look at some of this and they ask, well, like, doesn't that make God just sound like some problematic being that just wants to be pacified or appeased because he's angry about sin? But that's not the case. Because when we consider the cross and we consider the satisfaction of God's wrath and his anger that happened on the cross isn't us doing something to change God's mind. The cross, and consider this, is about God himself providing the solution that satisfies his own wrath. You had nothing to do with the cross besides your sin. We didn't. Like, our sin put him on that cross. But the cross was God himself providing the solution to appease his own anger and wrath towards sin. God didn't demand that we appease him. He came down, he provided the sacrifice, and he took the penalty on himself. Paul in Romans 3:25, talking about Jesus, says, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because God provided the solution. And when Jesus hung on that cross, all of the fury of God the Father's righteous anger against sin was poured out on him. Thankfully, it's not being poured out on you or on me. It was poured out on Jesus. Jesus bore it. And when he cried out on the cross, Jesus cried out at the end. He says, it is finished. When he cried out in that moment, that meant the wrath of God was fully satisfied because God dumped it all out on him instead of us. The wrath was exhausted, the justice was satisfied, and the debt was paid in full. So sacrifice, propitiation. One more word. Again, another word we'd never probably use, but it's a technical word called expiation. Expiation means our guilt is actually removed from us. It means our sin is covered. It says the stain is washed away. When you look at Isaiah 53, this is the main reason why we use this as our base passage for this morning. Look at how many times this chapter emphasizes this truth. You look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He bore them, he carried them, he took them. Look at verse 5. It says, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. Verse 6, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. God took it all, every sin, every offense, and he placed it on Jesus. Verse 11, it says, he shall bear their iniquities. Verse 12, he bore the sin of many. Over and over and over again through this passage, you see the same truth, that our sin was transferred to him. He carried it. He bore the weight. He suffered the consequences of these things. And when he died on that cross, our sin was dealt with completely and finally forever. That's still contingent upon us coming to him for salvation on this end of things. But his action in that moment provided the way for that to be completely true for each and every one of us. In the cross, our guilt can be removed, our sin can be covered, our debt can be canceled. He died as our substitute. He took our punishment. He satisfied God's justice. He removes our guilt. That is what happened on the cross. Again, titled this morning, The Death That Saves Us. Jesus' death did so much work. That was the only process by which our salvation was possible. So what does that mean for us as we consider the truth of that this morning? For us, as we stand here today and we reflect on, again, the truth and the depths of Jesus' death on that cross, for us, it means that we can stand before God not hoping that he just overlooks enough of my sin so that I can get in. We can stand before God knowing that he dealt with it completely. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, there's this contrast between the Old and the New Testament. It talks about in the Old Testament how there was a priest that stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never fully take away sins. But this man, talking about Jesus, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. It talked about these priests. They kept standing. Every day they kept ministering. They kept offering sacrifices day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, because those sacrifices were temporary. They were pointing forward to something better, but at that time they were temporary coverings of sin. But the passage says that Jesus, after he offered one sacrifice, sat down at the right hand of his Father because the work was finished. Because that one sacrifice was enough to save all of us. Verse 14 of that same passage says, for by one offering he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified, or those who are being transformed by God. It was just one offering, one time, forever. It wasn't a partial payment. It wasn't a down payment. It wasn't, he just put a down payment and we got to pay the rest. It wasn't a temporary fix. It was a perfect sacrifice that covers all of the problems that we've ever created. The wrath of God was satisfied, the guilt was removed, and the work was finished. So as we walk through everyday life and we reflect on the truth of these things, like really understanding these things, I hope it brings a sense of security. I hope it brings a sense of security, knowing these things like guilt might haunt you, shame might try to well itself up and take you down. The enemy might whisper to you, you've done too much for God to save you out of all of your problems. But when you understand the truth of this, you don't ever have to wonder if the cross was enough, because it was enough and it still is enough for you and for me, no matter what has led up to this point. You're not standing before God hoping that he's in a good mood. You're covered in the righteousness of Christ and the debt has been paid. And it should build within us a sense of, I hope, gratitude. The death that saves us cost everything. Jesus suffered, he bled, he died for you and for me. When you understand what he endured so that we could be forgiven, so that we can be reconciled with God, the relationship could be repaired, the only appropriate response to that is gratitude. And hopefully a life-changing gratitude. Like, I am so thankful that things are changing now because I understand the depths of what he did for me. It's the kind of gratitude that says, I don't live for myself anymore. I can't, because he gave everything for me. Now, what can I do for him? And beyond that gratitude, it should build within us worship. So when you understand what happened on that cross, you can't help but worship. Again, it's not just singing songs on Sunday morning, but it's living a life of worship. It's a life that says thank you for what you did for me. In every decision, in every priority, and in every relationship, it's a life that says thank you, God, for what you've done for me. So we sit here today, is that the life that we're living right now? Is our life right now in any way geared towards telling God thank you for everything that he's done for us? I think that's something we have to walk away thinking about today. Is my life geared towards thanking him for his goodness and his mercy towards me? But remember the question that we started with as we close. Why couldn't God just forgive us? I hope that we, in some way understand more of the answer to that question, because God is both perfectly just and he's perfectly loving. He couldn't just overlook sin and remain perfectly just. His holiness demanded that sin had to be dealt with. His righteousness required that justice be satisfied. But he loved us too much to just condemn us. The cross is where his justice and his mercy met perfectly, where his holiness was satisfied, and it's the moment that we were saved through Jesus' action. It's where his wrath was poured out and his love was displayed. It was where the problem was solved, and it's where we could be rescued. Jesus died as our substitute. Again, it's his death that saves us. No other person, no other way. Again, this is just an honest question. It's not an intellectual question. It's not, have you understood the information of this morning? My question to you is just personally, deeply, honestly within yourself, do you believe that? Do you believe that that's what Jesus did? Not just did it hypothetically, theoretically for everyone else, that he did it for you. Do you believe that? Do you believe that Jesus took your place? Do you believe that it's his death that saves you? Do you believe that he finished it and he paid the debt? Again, it's not just about facts that you know. It's about truth that you build and rest your life upon, because that's what the gospel is asking for. The gospel doesn't want you just to acknowledge that it exists. The gospel is asking you to trust, to have real faith in what Jesus Christ accomplished for each and every one of us. Jesus said that he alone is the way, the truth, and the life. Again, it's like, have we gone his way, or are we still trying to make our own? That's what Isaiah said. He's like, all of us, like sheep, we've been trying to make our own way to everywhere else but him. Jesus said, I'm the only way to get here. Have we gone his way, or are we still trying to make our own way?